Thank you so much, Anthony, for that lovely introduction. It's wonderful to see you, Sanneke. Hello to everybody in far-flung parts of the globe signing in on our chat here. It's really delightful to have you all. So I'm really honored to have this opportunity to talk to Sanneke tonight. I have known Sanneke for many years. We go way back. I've long been a fan of her work, as I think she knows, and she's produced this magisterial book that I think is going to have a significant impact on philosophy and enactive approaches generally, and philosophy of psychiatry, psychopathology more specifically. It's a wonderful book. And for those of you who've not read it yet, I cannot urge you strongly enough to go read it. I think one of its many virtues is it's deeply philosophical, but it is also wonderfully clear and lucid. And then I think as you describe it, Sanneke, it's written from a philosophical perspective, but you're not, as a philosopher, you're not writing for philosophers. You're writing more for people who have a practical orientation, perhaps clinicians or people experiencing living with psychiatric disorders. And in that sense, I think it's wonderful. I think you've succeeded in producing an extremely accessible book. So I'm really happy to have this opportunity to talk to you about this. So shall we start? Can I start just by asking you a question, Sanneke, a very general question? And I think I know the answer to this, but I suspect that our attendees would be interested in hearing more about this. Can you tell us just how you became interested in philosophy of psychiatry generally? What was your path to this discipline, phenomenological psychopathology, and then maybe a bit how you came to enactivism as your favorite framework for discussions in this domain?
Yeah. Thanks. Yes, thanks for your kind words. And yes, yeah, I ended up in philosophy of psychiatry actually by sort of more or less by accident. So I finished my philosophy studies and I was a bit at a loss of what to do. Embarking on a PhD, but that would be just more reading and such a lonely prospect. And then on the website jobsinphilosophy.com, I think it is, I saw this project that was called Disorders and Coherence of the Embodied Self, and this was this EU research project. And it was a multidisciplinary, and it had philosophy in it, neuroscience, phenomenology, developmental psychology, and it just looked like, wow, this is what I want to learn. And the philosophy jobs were in Heidelberg with Thomas Fuchs. And so I applied for the philosophy job, not knowing that it was actually a postdoc job. But so Thomas Fuchs replied saying, well, I also have a PhD job, and that will be interviewing young schizophrenic patients. Would that also be of interest to you? And I just thought that would be fantastic, basically, because the prospect of working with people rather than just only with text was just really appealing. And then when I came there, yeah, I really felt this was a field in which philosophical questions really, I mean, there are philosophical questions at stake throughout psychiatry, and yet it's all so relevant for real people's lives, so to say. And also I was really impressed with interviewing these young schizophrenic patients. They were so open, so willing to share their experiences, and also not just willing to share them, but also to reflect on them and so on. And and all these themes that came up, yeah, I really felt like this is a field where philosophy can do some good, hopefully. Well, hopefully, at least potentially. Let's put it like that. Yeah, and also also as part of this same European project was Hanneke de Haan. And she is my first link to enactivism, basically. So she was the philosophy postdoc on that same project. So she also supervised me. Apart from our friendship, that was also my introduction to enactivism. And then reading Evan Thompson's Mind in Life. So that was, and Ezekiel Di Paolo often came by to visit too. So yeah, I sort of got into enactivism through them, basically. And having said that, I think that coming from phenomenology, I had always felt that the experiences were so, the experiential side of things is so important, but I also missed the sort of the real or the real body, how should I say, the sort of biological material body, sort of, I felt this was not the whole story, so to say, that phenomenology does a hugely important part describing the experiences, but I thought, well, but there's more to human life in general, but to psychiatry certainly. And this was where enactivism sort of clicked in for me.
Wonderful. And I think this kind of hands-on experience that you have, this clinical experience, is very unique in our field. And I think that gives your work a very kind of first personal, I think, richness and complexity, that being faithful to the experiences of the individuals that you are just talking to and with about their lived experience of different psychiatric disorders, that comes through in the book. And so I think that gives your profile a very unique aspect that many of us, including myself, simply don't have. Before we move to some of the more specific parts of the book, can I ask you maybe just to discuss one more general question? I think it's interesting that you were a philosopher working in a hospital, actually talking to patients, talking to people, clinicians and psychiatrists. And I'd be curious to know how, as a philosopher, you were received. Did you have an argument you would give when people would ask, well, why is a philosopher here? What value does philosophy bring to psychiatry?
Luckily, I was never asked that question. Because I'm not sure whether I could answer it, at least at that point. I found people to be generally pretty open. Yes, and I'm not sure. I mean, it was my first job. It was abroad. It was in Germany. It's a different culture, especially the medical culture in Germany is much more formal than I was used to in the Netherlands. So I think I was forgiven also a lot because I was so clearly sort of a Dutch person who just, well, try to find her way in Germany. So maybe that helped a bit, so to say. Yes, so I think most of the people, sorry, actually did think that the work, so the interviews that I was doing were to get a grip on or an idea about what did people already experience before they had their first psychosis. So were there sort of, in their experience, were there signs that were already sort of showing towards a psychotic episode? So a really clinically relevant question, I guess. But I was really received very hospitably. So I could join all the meetings, and I joined all the staff meetings and be part of the department. So that was actually really, really good. And I don't know, I mean, I don't know whether people secretly sort of, well, raised an eyebrow here and there about the usefulness of a philosopher, but at least they were so, I mean, Germans, maybe it's their politeness or something, maybe it's that. They never made me feel uncomfortable, at least. They made me feel very welcome, actually, yeah.
Good, I'm glad to hear that. And I think what you said is very important. I think this comes through in the book, that I think one of the values of philosophy and phenomenology is it provides conceptual resources of vocabulary for describing experiences that can be often very difficult to capture and articulate. And it gives both individuals, clinicians trying to better understand them, as well as individuals living through these experiences, the language and a kind of conceptual framework to better come to grips with what's happening there. So it sounds like I'm sure you made a very important contribution to that culture in that regard. So let's maybe turn to some specific questions about the book now. It's a large, ambitious book with lots of different moving parts and wonderful arguments and things to discuss. But maybe the first thing we should start with is just a brief overview of the book. Can you give us a synopsis? What is the main argument of this book?
Yeah. So to start again from being based there in Heidelberg as a philosopher, I think one of the things that really struck me was the difference between the clinical meetings I had with all the people working at the department, where we talked about patients, well, their backgrounds, their family situation, their educational situation, how they were living economically, stuff like that. And And then when we had our scientific meetings, it would only be about the brain, really only be about neuroscientific findings. But it was so hard to sort of connect the two. They seemed to be such different worlds. This is what got me first interested in this, in also talking to the people working there, that I would see them at work, some of them at least. I would see them talk to patients, and I would see that they were working holistically, in the sense that they would just ask about, well, the patient's context, their history. I mean, all the things you would do if you want to form an image of who is, or get a feel for who is there in front of you. And then all we would do scientifically was talk about the brain. And also, if I asked them about this, they would often come up with what psychiatric disorders are eventually brain diseases, something like that, a sort of theoretical framework that was pretty reductionistic, especially when compared to what I saw them doing in the clinic. And this got me interested in this problem, so to say, that I thought that to think, how are all these elements connected? So clearly clearly the brain plays a role, but what role, and can it all be reduced to that? And I had a strong inclination to think that it couldn't, also coming from a phenomenological background, maybe. Sorry. And that's how I got started to think about what I later called the integration problem. So all these different factors, and they are so heterogeneous. So people would talk about basically their difficulties with maintaining friendships, or it would be about their difficulty of holding a job or something. But at the same time, they would also get medication, and how would that affect them too? And to sort of get an idea of how these very different dimensions hang together. That was the goal of my book, that I thought I want to have an idea, sort of a holistic view on psychiatry that's holistic without being vague, basically holistic. And this was also around the time that I discovered enactivism. And to me, that really seemed to be, if that is the perspective, if we look differently at how mind, world, and body relates, then lots of these problems in thinking about psychiatry and psychiatric factors, so to say, or aspects, they really fall into place, or they can be related differently. And that's what I wanted to do in the book. So I want to use insights from enactivism to solve psychiatry's integration problem. And for doing that, I explain what I see as the basic, as the sort of the basic commitments of enactivism. But I also add a bit, because I felt that something was still lacking, and that's what I call the existential dimension. I've been really wondering what to call that, but it has to do with the fact that we can relate to what we experience, or take a stance on what we experience, not just experience things. And that seemed hugely important in psychiatric practice and psychiatric disorders, and actually in human life in general, I would think. But that was something that I felt was insufficiently sort of developed in enactive theory. So what I do is I explain how I think that can be added to enactivism, while still keeping the core commitments of enactivism in place. And then I go and see how does this indeed work out when thinking about psychiatric disorders and their development, and what does this imply with regard to causality, with regard to development, with regard to treatment. Yes, and also some methodological sort of, or not really methodological, conceptual issues surrounding philosophy of psychiatry. Is that a bit what you, does that
It is, no, that's a great answer. I'm wondering if you can maybe give us a short description of how you understand your particular approach to enactivism. So, as I think probably a lot of people in the audience know, there's been an embodied turn in philosophy of mind and cognitive science for the past several decades, which has moved away from this very neurocentric way of thinking about the mind, what kind of thing the mind is, how it works, moving just away from focus on the brain, and bringing the body and the body's interactions with the world into our accounts, again, of both what a mind is and how minds work. And so this embodied and situated approach has become increasingly influential in various quarters. And enactivism is sort of a new player on the scene, in a sense. It's not that new because, of course, it goes back to Varela Thompson and Roche's book back in, what was it, 1992, The Embodied Mind, which is, I think, still standard reading for anyone interested in this. But enactivism, in some ways, is still a fairly new player on this scene. There's lots of different flavors of enactivism on offer at the moment. Can you say how you think about what enactivism is? What is your enactive framework, in other words?
Just saying to Joel just before we met that I was of course expecting this question, and yet I still don't have like a couple of sentences that I can just say. And activism is blah blah blah. But I will have a go at it. Yes. So what I think is the sort of the core to an activism. To just put it first in very abstract terms and then make it a little bit more concrete later on, I would say that it is a thoroughly relational approach, a relational ontology, in a way that I think is unique even in the embodied cognition kind of approaches corner, so to say. I think because it has this very thoroughly relational outlook on things or perspective, that's what makes it also I think the perfect candidate as an antidote towards dualism, any dualistic tendency, but also the kind of reductionist solutions to dualism that you see a lot. So, so for me, the value of enactivism is this relational perspective, which is really that neither our sense making, our cognition, nor our bodies, nor the kind of worlds we live in can be understood in isolation from each other. They are intrinsically linked in following the enactive life-mind continuity thesis, which basically says that any living organism requires sense making in order to stay alive, and it does so because it needs to interact with its environment to stay alive again. And because it needs to interact with its environment, it needs to be able to make some sense of it, basic though that may be. But taking this relational approach sort of has as a consequence, I think that if you want to look at some sort of phenomena, an enactive perspective would always encourage you to look at the context, the wider context, both in terms of, well, sort of spatial, so the context, but also historically and developmentally. So how did things end up there? So in a sense, it's almost the opposite of isolating and reifying something, and just trying to understand phenomena from this broader perspective. Yes, this is still, I realize this is still quite abstract. How can I make it more concrete, maybe?
Well, I think so. This, as I understand your approach, I think this notion of sense making is really crucial to the account you want to give, since most psychiatric disorders are disturbances of various sense making processes. Yeah. So maybe a summary of how you understand this notion would be useful.
Yeah. So sense making is the enactive term for cognition, so to say, and that's as Varela Thompson and Roche described it, this is very much, cognition is an embodied and embedded form of action with the environment. So embedded already means with the environment. So what they, like Joel already said, so what they come from, or what they sort of argue against, or where they're coming from and what they want to avoid, is this very internalist, cognitivist picture, where you have this, well, what Susan Hurley famously called the sandwich model of the mind. So you have the perception giving you input, then there's all the juicy stuff happening in the cognition in the head, and then you have the output in terms of the action that you perform. And activism just totally turns this, now not upside down, that's the whole thing. I think actually that when you would just turn it upside down, you get some sort of constructivism, right? Then you would have not being passively sort of imprinted, but actively sort of projecting. But it's not active projecting either. It's being in interaction with the environment. And the sense making refers to this evaluative interacting with the environment. So that really goes from very primitive organisms that sense, so to say, where there is food. The main example is always bacteria, who sense sugar and then move towards that. So that's the really basic kind of sense making, like being able to distinguish, but not distinguish something as food, obviously, but just distinguish their environment, within their environment, what's viable for them and what's dangerous for them, and things like that. Yeah, so sense making refers to this evaluative interaction.
So I love this notion of sense making, and I think part of the theoretical richness of this notion comes from the fact it recognizes we're more than just brains in bodies situated in the world. We're constantly doing things to and with our world, both alone and with others. And sense making, as you just said, is something that can happen at a very high level, narrative level. We can talk about the experiences that we have, the actions that we undertake. We can interpret the things that we do, again, both alone and with others. That's part of how you understand this notion of taking an existential stance on one's experiences, which is very important for your argument. But as you were just saying, it's also something that's a very low-level fundamental process in a very basic way. We are affectively, emotionally drawn to certain things, repelled from other things. We seek out some kinds of people and avoid others. And these sense-making processes are things that are constantly happening at multiple levels and in multiple ways. And this is what really binds us into our world in very deep and complicated ways. And so I love this notion. And can you just say a bit, and I think maybe perhaps an example here, again, for people who have not read the book, can you give us an example of a psychiatric disorder that might be characterized as a disturbance of sense-making, as opposed to just thinking of it in terms of some sort of neurological or brain-based disorder? What would that look like, that kind of story, some sort of disorder as a disturbance of sense-making process?
Yes. Yeah, I think in general we can say that, or I would say that psychiatric disorders are structurally disordered patterns of sense making. So it's not just a one-time off, so to say. There is a sort of structural bias in a certain type of sense making, you could say. So for instance, when you have an anxiety disorder, you experience the world as overly threatening. And overly threatening is, of course, already a sort of normative indication, but meaning that it's well, what I would say, not properly attuned to, so to say, to the environment, in the sense that it's not that dangerous as you, or not that threatening as you experience it to be. Or take depression is another, I think, good example in which the world just appears meaningless and gray, and the whole future, and not just the future, but also the past, just appear meaningless to you, and the feeling is one of guilt and suffering, and what I think this sense making, this pattern of sense making sort of brings out, I think, is that the world really is different when you are depressed. The world really does look different to you. You experience the world differently. And not just you experience that, but that, of course, also affects your interactions with the world. I think we all know the example of when you are yourself happy, and you just had heard some good news or something, and you're maybe a bit smiling in yourself, and you're walking on the streets. Well, nowadays with masks and so on, that doesn't show so much, but before masks, then you would find that if you are cheerful, people would smile at you, and you get this positive energy going and so on. Whereas when you just a bit annoyed by things, or just slept too little or whatever, and you're just a bit grumpy, and then it's much more likely that you will meet grumpiness in other people as well. So this is, of course, a very, very crude example, but in general, the way you interact with the world will also affect, so to say, the kind of interactions you will have. And what's this? So this sense making really is about this interaction with the world. And when you talk about, for instance, a brain disease, of course the brain is implied here. but I think it would be problematic, and you lose out on a lot if you would reduce all of that to just one part of what I would say is a much larger complex system going on. And also it would be difficult to explain also those, there's also the what you could call maybe existential loops or referential loops or reflexive loops, where for instance in depression it's also that it's not just that your current experience is of meaninglessness, but also that when you can't imagine things to be differently, so your very reflection on your situation is colored by the depression as well, making this also a different experience from, I mean, if you are just feeling low, but you can still sort of think, okay, I'm feeling low because I had this and this nasty experience this morning or so on, then you can put things in perspective and you're not completely overwhelmed by it or taken over by it, so to say. Yes, so that was, so yeah, does that answer your question?
That's a really helpful example, thank you. And I think you've just demonstrated very forcefully, I think one of the virtues of the enactive approach that you favor is that it brings the world into the story, essentially. Mm-hmm. Of not just, again, what kind of things psychiatric disorders are, but how they develop. They become part of the causal story of how psychiatric disorders both develop and are maintained over time. And I think one of the interesting consequences, and I'd be curious to hear what you have to say about this, of this enactive framework that does bring the world into the story in the way that you described, is it really seems to extend, at least potentially, the way we think about both agency and responsibility. So in your example, if somebody is feeling severely depressed, for example, they're clinically depressed, they are going to approach the world in a particular sort of way. It's going to have a particular sort of coloring. It's not going to present the kind of vibrancy and possibility that it does for people who are not depressed. But that's not the full story, of course. There are other people in this, that they share this world with. And so if they present as a depressed person, they might come off as surly, as grumpy, as unfriendly. And that presentation is going to affect how others approach them, which might in turn reinforce their depression, their feeling of alienation, this loss of possibility they experience. So I guess my question, it's a very general question, is that this approach does seem to place some responsibility and shared agency on the people that individuals who share the world, as individuals with psychiatric disorders, share their world with. And so how do we deal with something like that? Is that, do you have any thoughts on how other people come into the story and the kind of responsibility that we have for individuals' experience of psychiatric disorders?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a nice question. And thanks also for eloquently, even if you eloquently summarize what I say, even in a way that I think, oh yeah, that's the way to put it.
Nonsense.
So thanks.
Being very humble. Go read her book. You'll see she's an extraordinary writer. So.
But yeah, so yeah, I think this is part of what's attractive about the term enact, right? That we enact certain patterns, and this is not just pathologically. I mean, I think having a certain character basically also is that you are more inclined to enact certain patterns, so than others, and indeed that you also draw others with you. I mean, if I'm going to be super dominant in a relationship, that will affect how the other responds to me, right? Whereas when I'm going to be really pleasing kind of attitude, then the other will be more likely to take another role, complementary in a sense to what I enact. I think that we all enact certain patterns, and yeah, and in terms of the responsibility, I think this is a really difficult one. Because I do feel we have that, and I think, I mean, I think everyone just feels that simply because you're human, you care about your loved ones and you want to help them. Yet I also know from own experience that it can be really difficult to actually help someone, especially when they are so, I mean, the whole point about the psychiatric disorders is that people are stuck, and it's not so easy to get them out of there. Sorry. And and there's only so much you can do, right? So I think that, well, this is one of my research interests, not just at the moment, but also at the moment, to think of the role of loved ones in terms of what can loved ones do, basically, what is still available, and also what would patients prefer their loved ones to do. So in the interviews, I'm now interviewing people with recurrent depressions, and one of the things that comes up when I discuss these matters with them is, for instance, they really don't need good advice, like, why don't you go for a walk, or why don't you just do some fun things and stuff like that, and people just feel misunderstood and not recognized. And whereas what they find helps them is just listening, being supported, being there, basically. But I think it's really difficult, and I think it's not for nothing that being a therapist is a proper job, so to say, to really invite people to engage in a different sense making in a very a safe environment also. And that's the best you can do, I think, as a loved one as well. But yeah, I find it difficult. On the one hand, I want to indeed acknowledge that we are such relational beings and that there's a responsibility that comes from it, and also naturally, I think, is felt. But there are limits to that responsibility as well, in terms of what you can do to someone who is stuck. There has to be also some movement from the person, him or herself, because it's not something that you can do for the other person, right? But I do agree with you that actually this enactive, like any sort of holistic or systemic approach, does stress the importance of the environment, which is also, of course, to an important extent, also loved ones and friends and family and so on. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. That's extremely helpful. Thank you, Sanneke. So the questions are now coming in fast and furious. So thank you, everyone. Please keep sending them my way, and we can start working through some of them if you'd like. So let's see, so many good questions here. I think a number of people have asked about the role of the brain in your story. If there's a strong relational element in enactivism that really strongly emphasizes bringing the world into the story and sort of giving us this more complex causal account of how psychiatric disorders develop and are sustained, that moves away from just looking at neural mechanisms to all the complicated dynamics that link us to the world and other people. Suddenly that story not only gets very causally complicated and messy, trying to understand both methodologically from a descriptive or scientific medical perspective, but also from a therapeutic perspective, it also potentially loses the role of the brain in the story. And I think a lot of us still have this kind of stubborn intuition, and maybe this is me just kind of confessing I'm still a bit of a neuroreductionist in some ways at heart, despite myself. Where does the brain go in this complex causal account that an active approach wants to give us?
Yes, well, thanks for this opportunity. I think that's helpful too. I really want to stress that I'm in no sense denying the fundamental importance of the role of the brain in psychiatric disorders. The only thing that I want to get rid of is the idea that there's some sort of causal primacy of the brain involved. And as I see it, the brain, let's just say the brain is an organ in a person who's interacting with the world. And what you just mentioned with the causality, I think that's super important too, that we have to I think it's really helpful if we try to make a switch there, that we are so used in thinking linearly about, do you put it like that? Linearity. So causally, to just think, there's this one thing and then that's the effect of it. Whereas when you think of this as a complex system of which the brain is a part, so you have this person interacting with the world, and the brain is, of course, an important part of the person, how to think of the causality involved there. And what I think is helpful is to really try to resist this sort of linear thinking, like we have something happening in the brain, and this causes a certain experience, for instance. Or the other way around, something happens in the world, and then this does something to our brain. Of course, things that happen in the world do something to our brain, but not in a sort of domino-like way, like something happens in the world and then something happens in the brain or something like that. And this is where I felt that the metaphor of making a cake, I felt was really helpful for me, at least, to think differently about causality. I'm a really big fan of the Great British Bake Off, and I don't bake actually myself, so this is all sort of.
You would never know it from the work that metaphor does in your book. You would. I assumed you were a baker, given how often you talk about baking cakes. Sorry.
No, I don't. I just watch other people bake cakes. It's totally armchair knowledge. This, but I've gotten into this through this Great British Bake Off. I've gotten into sort of all these ways in which the ingredients affect each other, and of course they affect each other also not in a domino-like way, but rather by being fused in a different whole, right? So you make a dough, and there's these ingredients that of course affect the quality of the dough, and yet you can't just one-to-one point anymore to this causes that, or maybe I should put it differently. What I found really helpful is that you can still make distinctions, so you can still talk about local versus global causality and global versus local causality, but not in this domino-like way. So one of the examples that I give is the amount of sugar that you add, right? That if you add just a little bit of sugar, you won't notice it. If you add a lot of sugar, then that will affect the taste of the cake as a whole. But but the sugar is of course difficult to sort of it's part of the cake, so to say. So now I get a bit lost in my own in my own metaphor. But what I wanted to stress is basically that rather than having this one thing affecting the other, you can see that, for instance, by putting the cake in the oven and setting the temperature at a certain amount, so cooler or lower, then this affects the cake as a whole, but it also, of course, affects its elements in it. And in a similar way, I would say that if something happens to you, this affects you as a person, and this will include your brain, right? It will include your brain. On the other hand, if you tweak something in the brain by taking medication, for instance, if you do that to a certain threshold, like the amount of sugar, so to say. So if you change something in the serotonin levels, there will be a point at which this will have a global effect. So the sugar on the taste of the cake as a whole, the serotonin on the experience of the person in the world. And yet there is not this sort of one-to-one sugar taste of the cake. I mean, sugar is part of this cake, right? Yeah, so I hope that helps a bit to sort of. I'm not sure if that helps others. Otherwise, please do ask a follow-up question. But I do want to stress the importance of the brain just not have a primary causal role, but just as being part of this complex system, this bigger complex system.
That's really helpful, Sanneke. And sorry, I'm chuckling as you're answering because Anthony is now posting cake emojis in the chat, and as people have said, that's making us all very hungry. So. So a number of people have asked about the causal role of the brain in this large relational and active account. And so maybe just I'll pick out one of them that I think picks up some things we've just been talking about. I think you started to answer this at the end. But so Karsten Struhl says, how would enactivism explain how taking a drug could make it possible to control a psychiatric disorder like schizophrenia? How would its working on the brain change its sense-making function in relation to the patient's interaction with the world?
I'm sorry, could you, there was just an answer to me, my internet connection was somewhat.
Oh, sure.
So could you ask that final question once more?
Yeah, sorry, this is Karsten Struhl, I think, picking up some themes we were just talking about, the brain's causal role in the account that you give us. In short, how would an activist account how taking a drug to control psychiatric disorders like schizophrenia which obviously then the drug has a direct causal effect on brain structures, brain processes. How would they describe that in relation to the patient's interaction with the world? So how would sense making fit into this account, this more relational sense making framework?
Yeah, yeah. If I would, yeah. So two things. On the first, I should say that from an enactive perspective, taking drugs is not just intervening on the brain, because it's actually an action you do as a person in a certain context. So, and we all know from the so-called placebo effects that these things matter. So if I get prescribed this drug by someone that I really trust, this might, not will, but might affect the effectiveness of the drug. So the drugs, first of all, they don't just affect the brain. It's the whole setting, and it's the drug taking, so to say, that's a personal act in a context. Yet, of course, it has an effect on the brain, and this in turn has an effect on people's experiences. So, and how I see this causality is, I have my book here. Maybe I can quickly sort of see if I find a picture of a complex sort of, I usually show, yeah, this is not really a picture that I'm looking for. I usually in my in presentations and so on, I just have this image of a very complex, all kinds of nodes, all kinds of relationship between the nodes. And well, I'll just show a picture from my book.
Oh, I think we lost your audio. I think you're covering the audio with the book, but that was really helpful. We can see.
Oh, okay.
There we go. Now you're back. Yep.
Okay.
That's really helpful, Sanneke. Yeah. So we can see complex interrelation between these different nodes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So from that perspective, intervening in the brain is intervening in a very highly connected node of the system, to put it a bit technically. So you intervene if you would look at it from this network perspective, you're intervening in one of these nodes that's related to many other nodes, and this will of course have an effect on the larger part of the system, and I think there's no problem in just seeing that there is this causal effect through the brain on the experience. It's just that how you understand what that trajectory, so to say, is like. So it's not like something happens in the brain and this sort of something physiological happens and then some magically this has some experiential effect. Rather, you change the system as a whole by changing the brain, and thereby you are enabling different interactions with the world, and hopefully that's the way it's going to sustain a change. So like with antidepressants or with SSRIs for anxiety disorders, by lowering the anxiety, people manage to engage with the world again in a different way, and these interactions in turn can have this positive feedback loop effects. So taking a drug is very much influencing not just the experience, but by influencing the experience, you are influencing the way someone interacts with the world and is able to interact with the world. And this can in turn be a very positive feedback loop. Yes, and so I would say that taking drugs is just one and potentially very powerful way of shaking up the system, you could say. Yes, and other sort of interventions like psychotherapy might be longer. May take longer. They intervene in the system in a different way, but they can have sort of similar effects. But they clearly do so in a different way. Is this a bit of an answer to?
That's very helpful, and I think it actually touches on a question that Eduardo Schenberg had asked about how an active approach would account for placebo effects in psychopharmacology. So thank you, Eduardo, for that question. And again, I have to say, unfortunately, there's so many great questions here. We're not going to get to everybody. There is the question from Lucy Osler from Copenhagen, who says, if sense making is essentially relational, where and how do appropriateness and normativity come into the picture on your account?
Yes.
Do an activist have a view of normativity?
Yes. Very much so. I think actually from an enactive perspective, norms and values just are there from the very start. But it's very right to ask. I mean, this is of course a fundamental point in philosophy of psychiatry, that when you talk about appropriateness, so I say the sense making is not attuned or it's not appropriate to the situation, I am saying something about there is a norm involved, right? Yeah, so from and this is actually something that I think is a very fundamental discussion point within enactivism, or at least at least this is what I get quite some reactions on, because with this sort of existential dimension that I propose, I'm basically saying that a lot of let me put it differently. Most enactivists will agree that by accepting the idea of a life-mind continuity and there being a fundamental dependence of the organism on the environment, there is a normativity already at stake, in the sense that by trying to self-maintain, the organism will see its environment in a valenced way, you could say. So some things are relevant for it and others are not, and some things are in a positive way and others in a negative way relevant. And so there's already the philosopher Hans Jonas also called it, it's already like values involved as soon as you have a metabolic system that requires interaction with its environment. But I would go a step further and say that, at least for us human beings, with this stance-taking capacities, there's also existential values coming in. So not just the norm of self-maintaining, not just the norm of staying alive, but actually trying to live a good life and live a dignified life and be a good person, to be a person in the world. And I think this is a fundamental difference between sort of organisms interacting with their environments and persons interacting with their worlds, that we have this thoroughly ethical or moral, I'm never quite sure how to call it, but say moral dimension to our way of being in the world. And that's not just something that's sort of added on top, like we are biological beings and then we also have this, but it changes our very way of being in the world, and makes this a moral way of being in the world. And the norms involved in, so when we talk about something as a disorder, I mean, on the one hand, we can refer that back. This is actually a discussion I had with Chris Nielsen, who also has an enactive account of psychopathology, but he focuses much more on a sort of functionalist or evolutionary perspective of normativity. And he would say eventually things come down to self-maintenance. So also psychiatric disorders, the disorder bit is the way in which they don't contribute self-maintenance. Sorry, I need. Sorry about that. But I disagree with that, because I really feel that this is an impoverishment of the way in which we humans are actually interacting with our worlds, which is much richer than that. And it's not just about self-maintaining, it's about being a good person, like I said. And that also means that psychiatric disorders and the kind of norms and values involved there go much further than, I think what is at stake is being a good person in the world, not just maintaining yourself as an organism, but actually trying to be a person in the world, which can be really damn hard, I think. And
Agreed.
Is also why we have psychiatric disorders, I think, because that is so difficult and challenging. And
so that's very helpful. Again, so many great questions here. I know we're getting close to running out of time, but since you mentioned this notion of the existential stance and the importance of the existential dimension and accounting for this dimension in how we think about psychiatric disorders.
Yeah.
I think that transitions nicely to a question from Eros Corvallo. So it seems, at least as far as we know, that the ability to take this existential stance, which simply means to kind of relate to, reflect on, our experiences, our actions, place our experiences and actions in a larger context and interpret their meaning for our lives. But that capacity is something that is very minimal or absent in most non-human animals. And yet Eros asked, there's some evidence that non-human animals do seem susceptible to some psychiatric disorders. So given the importance of this existential stance in your enactive account, how would your framework apply to psychiatric disorders in non-human animals?
Yeah, yes, and thanks. I actually think I owe Eros an email on this.
Well, he didn't say that in his question, by the way. He very discreetly left that out of the chat, so you guys can deal with that off screen.
Okay, yeah. So a couple of things I want to say there. First of all, I think it's an empirical question whether or not other animals have this existential stance taking. I don't, and also I think it's empirically we can already see that some sort of elements of this skill, of this collection of skills, are there in animals. We know that there's this self-recognition in the mirror and so on. Frans de Waal, this Dutch primatologist, has all these wonderful examples of what we would call altruistic behavior, empathy, and so on. So I think it's an empirical question whether or not other animals are capable of this existential stance taking too. But if this is lacking, sorry, I need to take another sip of tea. Then I don't think we can properly speak of psychiatric disorders. I mean, I don't want to deny suffering at all. Yeah. But I think that the sort of the depth of suffering, or the kind of problems that the kind of vulnerabilities that we have, that they are tied to this specific way of being in the world. That's also an existential way of being in the world. So I would hesitate to non-existential, non-reflexive animals, so to say that they have psychiatric disorders.
So we would need a new category or concept to characterize the sort of suffering or disordered behavior and experiences that they're having, and preserve the concept of psychiatric disorders for human experience, disordered human experience. Yeah.
Yes. Helpful. Yes, I think so. And I do want to also something that I recently came to think of, that even if humans are sort of, because people sometimes ask me, but isn't this sort of human exceptionalism? But even if humans are exceptional, even if it turns out empirically to be the case that we only are these existential beings, then I still think this is not exceptionalism, in the sense that every sort of being has its uniqueness, and there's no hierarchy in uniqueness, right? I mean, the way in which bats, I mean, notoriously by Thomas Nagel, sort of make sense of their environment is, for us, it's crazy. It's such a different way of being in the world. Or say fungi, sort of communities of fungi. I mean, that's unique, right? So human sense making and human way of being in the world may be unique in this sense, but I don't by any means try to sort of make a hierarchy towards other animal life or other ecosystems, you could say. Sorry about that. Yeah. So so I think that's I would just not call just non-reflexive suffering. I think it's just really something different from when you can relate to what happens to you. Yeah.